What's going on, guys? Mr. Ballen here, former Navy SEAL turned internet storyteller with a focus on the strange, dark, and mysterious. And speaking of mysterious, today I have a mystery for you, and it's one of the more recent mysteries. It happened in 2014 and spanned a couple of years following that. It is a story that plays out like a psychological thriller, and in fact, Netflix recently purchased the rights to make a movie or show about this case from the family that were the victims of this case. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have this all-American family that purchases their dream home. They're getting ready to move in, and they start receiving these awful, wrathful, threatening letters from some anonymous person or group. The letters get progressively worse and indicate that whoever is watching them very closely at all hours and is able to see things that are not easy to spot just from walking by. This is someone who is really intensely focused on the family. I think that the best way to watch this video and learn about this case, to really appreciate what this family went through, is to put yourself in the position of being the Broaddus family. That's the family that purchases the house. Imagine you're in their position. Would you have stayed or would you have left? And I'd love to hear about it in the comments section. So let's dive in. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus purchased their dream home. It is a $1.3 million 6-bedroom house in Westfield, New Jersey, which is a very affluent northern New Jersey town. So the house they purchased was on Boulevard, that's the street name, and Boulevard within Westfield is, at the time, was like the street. If you lived on Boulevard, you had made it. I would say that times have changed because now Boulevard is remembered as the place where this case happened, so I would say it's probably not the best place to live anymore, but at the time it was like Derek and Maria were living their dreams and they knew it. 3 days after the sale of the house, they hadn't moved in yet. Derek had gone to the house to do some painting of the walls and some simple house renovations. I think he was just so excited about this house, he just wanted to go over and just kind of be in the space. So his wife and his kids are back at their old house that they had sold but hadn't moved out of yet. And so he's at the new house and he's doing these simple renovations and he's like, you know what, I'm gonna check the mail. Because even though they'd only owned the house for 3 days, he was like, you know what the heck, see what it feels like to go collect the mail, because this is going to be my new home. And so he goes out and he opens the mailbox, and inside is this little tiny card-shaped envelope addressed to the new owners.
Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I'll find out.
The letter goes on to identify what kind of car they were driving. It was a Honda minivan. It went on to say how many contractors were in and around the house over the past couple of days that were doing some renovations in the house. It even said that, I believe I've counted that you have 3 children. Someday I will learn their names and I will call to them and I will take them from you. You know, it's like a reconnaissance of his family had already begun as soon as they moved in. And so Derek is reading through this letter and he's realizing that whoever is sending this is not a friendly neighbor at this point. This is someone who is out to harm them in some way. So he takes the letter, he runs back into the house, shuts all the windows, locks all the doors, leaves the house and goes right back to his wife and his kids that are at their old home. And they promptly call the police. Police show up, they read the letter, and they're like, what is this? Do you have enemies? Who wrote you this? Because even the language inside the letter was it was not quite Old English, but close. It was like this bizarre writing, and it was just very stalkerish and awful, and the police just don't really know what to make of it. And Derek and Maria are obviously very upset. They haven't even moved into the house yet. But this is a big cause for concern. So the letter did not have a return address. But at the end of the letter, it just said,
Who am I? I could be someone that's walking by your house every day. I could be someone driving by your house every day. I could be one of your neighbors. I could be anybody that you see at any given day, and you'll never know.
And it just says, signed, The Watcher. After the police leave that night and promise to launch their own investigation, Derek and Maria, they're totally on edge. And so they write an email, even though it's super late, to the Woods family. They're the family that sold the house to Derek and Maria. And they say, hey, we just got this strange threatening letter. Have you received anything like this? Because the Watcher claims to have been watching you for the entire time you were there. And the Woods family writes back and they say, 3 days, I think it was 3 days before we actually left the house, we did receive a letter. It wasn't threatening. It was just thanking us for our time in the house and treating it with respect, and that it would be taken care of going forward, and that this person would look after the house for us, and it was signed The Watcher. But to be honest, we didn't think much of it. We crumpled it up and threw it away. So the Broadduses decide that they are not going to rush to actually move into the new house. They had thought about doing it, but they decide with this letter that maybe it's best to hold off a little bit. And so Derek and Maria would do day trips with the kids. They'd go do a day trip, do some renovations, make sure that the contractors that were there were doing a good job getting the house in order, and then they would come back to the house that they were still living in. About 2 weeks after that letter was found, Maria is there with the kids, and she gets to the new house and she sees there's a letter from the Watcher, the same envelope, same writing on the outside, and so she immediately calls the police even before she reads it. She opens it up and it says,
Welcome again to your new home at 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy and I have been watching you unload carfuls of your personal belongings. The dumpster is a nice touch. Have they found what's in the walls yet? In time, they will.
The Watcher goes on to identify each of their kids by nickname and by birth order, which implies that whoever this was close enough to Maria or to Derek when they were speaking directly to their kids using their nicknames that they overheard. Because it's one thing to know the children's full names, because it's possible that you could have looked it up online or something, but to know their nicknames, that implies a level of proximity that even though they knew the Watcher was probably in the neighborhood, almost definitely, this meant they were practically on top of one another. And it gets creepier. The Watcher also in this letter asks, about one of the children and says, is she going to be an artist? I saw her using her easel yesterday. Well, the easel that this girl had been using is in a back room of the house that is mostly obscured by trees and shrubbery. There's really only one vantage point where you could see this child. And it would mean you're right on the property, like pretty much in plain view of anybody there. And with Maria and Derek and basically everyone on high alert looking for this person, it seems odd that they could be able to see this girl working at her easel in this kind of hidden back room and not be spotted. And then of course, to kind of seal the deal, making this letter just totally terrifying, they go on to say,
Do your kids go in the basement? I'd be afraid if I were them. It's far away from the rest of the house, and if you were upstairs, you would never hear them scream. Who has the bedrooms facing the street? I'll know as soon as you move in. Then I can plan better.
So at this point, Derek and Maria are in full crisis mode, because it's one thing to be watched, which is bad. It's another when the person watching you is now overtly threatening your family, your kids. It's a bad situation. So Derek and Maria at this point, they don't know if they're even ever going to move into this new house. It felt unsafe. And so for a few weeks, they're kind of teetering on whether it's worth moving in or not, and so that they aren't there. They're not going to the new house at all. And a third letter arrives basically saying, where are you? The house misses you, obviously from the Watcher. At one point between the first letter and third letter, Derek was speaking with John Schmidt, who lived 2 doors down from their new property on Boulevard. And John was saying that Derek ought to look into the Langfords. It was a family that lived right next to their new house, kind of a little bit of a strange family. It was a 90-something-year-old mother and her adult children who lived with her, who were all in their 60s. And one of the children, Michael, he was just known in the area about being a little bit odd. Like he would just kind of creep out other people. It wasn't uncommon to have him like walk across people's property, like little things like that, like looking in windows, just giving the vibe that he was a little bit strange and people didn't really like being around him. So Derek brings it up to the police that, hey, you should look into Michael Langford. He lives right near us. Neighbors are saying he's a little bit off. The police were like, actually, he was the first person we talked to. We brought him in, we questioned him, he denied it, we have no evidence tying him to it, and we just don't think it's him. And then later on in the investigation, they would actually do a DNA sample from one of the letters, and they would find out that it was a woman's DNA. And so that effectively ruled out Michael Langford, but the Langfords had a daughter. And so they decided maybe it could be her. And so they actually got a water bottle from her that they found, and they tested that, and it wasn't a match. So the Langfords were ruled out. Derek is growing increasingly more paranoid and angry. He went from being scared of what was potentially going to happen to feeling like, how dare you threaten my family, my kids? And he started telling the police, like, if you don't find who's doing this, I'm going to figure out who it is. And then you're not going to be dealing with, a stalking case. You're going to be dealing with a different kind of case, if you catch my drift. And so the police were like, don't do anything crazy. We're working as hard as we can. It's just there's not much to go on here. Derek wasn't okay with that. He set up this elaborate camera system in and around his house, the new house. He started staying at the new house, turning off all the lights and crouching behind windows and staring at the mailbox in hopes of being able to confront anybody who went near it. He ended up hiring 2 former FBI agents to launch his own private investigation. He hired a handwriting expert to analyze the letters themselves to see if they could pick up details about who this was and potentially profile them. And this person, all they could conclude was it was someone who was really, really mad. But all those things really didn't lead to any results. It was just Derek had become obsessed, and he was willing to basically do anything to find out who the heck is writing these letters. So at this point, the Broadduses had already sold their old house. They were still living in it because they hadn't moved into the new house, the house being watched. But at some point, the new owners of the house they sold were ready to move in. And so the Broadduses had to move in with Maria's family, but were still paying the mortgage on 657 Boulevard. At this point, the community started kind of spreading rumors about the Broaddus family. People believed that the reason they weren't moving into this beautiful new home was, they were getting a divorce, or they had some legal problems. The letters and what was going on with these letters, that was not widely known. There was speculation about it, but no one really knew for sure. So Derek and Maria kind of gradually became pariahs, and they ultimately decided that they're just going to sell this house, this new house they purchased, because they need the money. They've tied up a lot of money in it, and they feel like, we'll sell the house and we'll move on. But by the time they listed it, enough rumors were circulating about the weirdness around that house and why no one was moving into it, and the weirdness with Derek and Maria, that nobody wanted to buy. And so they initially list this property above what they paid because they had put $100,000 into the house in renovations. They just kept doing renovations, and that was their way of justifying not moving in. And they were like, we'll keep fixing it up. It'll be better once we move in. But, so they put $100K in, and no one bid. They lower the price, no one bid. They continued to lower the price to where it was like a full-blown deficit. Still, no one made an offer. So it sat vacant. At this point, Maria and Derek turned their frustration towards the previous owners. Because as I mentioned earlier, they had received a letter from the Watcher. Granted, it was, at the very end of their stay in this house, but it was before they gave over the keys to the Broaddus family. And Derek and Maria felt like the fact that they got an anonymous letter that was literally signed The Watcher, that name alone was kind of ominous enough that they felt like the Woods family should have disclosed that to the Broaddus family before they moved in. And so they filed a legal complaint against the Woods family, basically saying that you held information that potentially would have kept us from moving in and not having this problem. Well, Derek and Maria were assured by their legal team that at most, small legal newswire might pick up this lawsuit, and that would be it. But the story it got picked up by a number of outlets. The fact that they were filing a complaint against the previous owners over basically a stalker. And all of a sudden, they were all over the news. The Broaddus family had over 300 media requests. There were TV stations and news stations camped out on their front lawn. Everybody wanted to know what's going on with this bizarre, watcher. It became this huge thing. And so for Derek and Maria and their family, they had to vacate Westfield because it was basically not only unsafe because they were being watched by this phantom menace, but now they couldn't escape the media pressure and all the speculation from their nosy neighbors. It was just a total train wreck. Finally, the Broaddus family got some good news, literally years after this first letter is sent and they tied up all their money in this new house. A family agrees to rent the house. Now, this is going to be at a loss for the Broaddus family. The rent money will not even cover the mortgage, but to them who've just been sitting on this worthless property, they've just been eating away at their finances, this was a huge win. The Broaddus family, they put into the contract with this new family that, hey, you know what's going on here with the watcher. If you get another letter, you're able to renege on this contract. And so the new family moves in, and 2 weeks into being there, what do you think happens? Another letter shows up.
You wonder who the watcher is. Turn around, idiots. Maybe you even spoke to me, one of the so-called neighbors who has no idea who the watcher could be. Or maybe you do know and are too scared to tell anyone. My soldiers of the boulevard followed my orders to a T. They carried out their mission and they saved the soul of 657 Boulevard with my orders. All hail the watcher.
The renter was also mentioned in this letter and was definitely spooked. But they decide that they're still willing to stick around because they knew going in this could happen. They just asked that the Broaddus family install even more cameras. And so they did that, they installed more cameras, and they decided to stay. Derek and Maria are obviously disheartened, but at the same time, now they have more evidence against the watcher. And so they take this new letter, they bring it to the police, and unfortunately, much like the other few letters they'd received, there was nothing much to go on, except that you have this person claiming to watch them, but no hard evidence to tie it to anybody. So once again, they got nowhere. After renting this house out for a while to this family at a deficit, the Broaddus family in 2019 finally decide to just sell the house at a $400,000 deficit. It was just a huge nightmare, and at this point they were willing to pay $400,000 to get rid of it. Before they sold it, they received one more letter, and this is what it said.
You are despised by the house, and the watcher won.
Despite the investigation by police and the unofficial investigation by Derek's private investigators, we are not anywhere closer to figuring out who the watcher is, or what's hidden in the walls. It's all still a huge mystery. Many people have speculated that the Broaddus family, that Derek specifically, was probably the person who wrote the letters, because in fact, he would later admit that he wrote a number of anonymous letters to people in the community that had been bad-mouthing he and his family. But he said it was purely out of frustration. I wanted to scare them and make them, feel what it was like to have the watcher watching them. But he said, this whole situation has really devastated them financially and emotionally, and kind of ruined their ability to stay in the town that they loved so much. So it just, the angle that he stood to benefit from this, it's not a very good theory in my opinion. In addition, recently Netflix bought the rights to their story. But if Derek and his family had said, what we're going to do is we're going to set up this elaborate mystery around ourselves for years in order to secure movie rights, you'd be putting your kids through something so traumatic. And so the idea of having your kids have to live with the fear of being attacked and getting bullied at school because everybody talks in these communities, that seems far-fetched too. It remains to be seen who the watcher is, but to this day it remains a mystery. So if you haven't already, please click like and subscribe. I am going to be trying to do 2 or more stories a week. I'm really making a push to make YouTube my primary, so I hope you'll tag along. If you want to talk to me separately, you can DM me on Instagram. That's JohnBallen416. Also, go follow me on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen. And that's going to do it, guys. I hope this was interesting, and I'll talk to you soon.
Both of today's stories are about just how hard it is to really know somebody. Basically, everybody beneath their exterior is oftentimes not what you think they are. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and steal the glass tray inside of their microwave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in March of 2004, a 53-year-old handyman named Carl Fenwick sat on the floor of a vacant studio apartment in the rundown apartment building where he lived and worked in northern England. The apartment building was called The Cliff, and it was across the street from the ocean in the coastal town of Seaton Carew. Carl was in the middle of painting the apartment and getting it ready for a new tenant. But he had stopped to eat some lunch and to read a few chapters of one of his favorite spy novels. Carl loved spy novels, and he had a few that he just read over and over again. But as he turned the page, something out the window caught his eye. It was his landlady, Anne Darwin, who lived in a big Victorian house right next door. And at this moment, she was standing in front of her house with her 2 adult sons, Anthony and Mark, and they were all dressed in black, and each were holding a wreath made of flowers. And now, Carl felt a little bit like a spy himself, as he secretly watched the family of 3 walk across the street together to this grassy knoll that looked out over the water. Anne and her sons bowed their heads, and Carl could tell they were very likely praying, and then all 3 of them tossed their wreaths into the ocean. Carl knew that Anne and her sons were honoring Anne's husband, John Darwin, who had actually died in a kayaking accident 2 years ago, basically in the water right out in front of their house. Carl could also see that Anne was visibly shaking, so he knew she must be crying. And when he saw that, Carl himself started to feel sad, because Carl cared deeply for Anne. He was not just her handyman and tenant. They had been secretly romantically involved ever since he had moved into the Cliff almost 2 years ago. But Carl had actually known Anne for most of his life, and had been in love with her for decades. So Carl and Anne were both from a town that was near Seaton Carew. And Carl had first seen Anne on the school bus in high school, but he hadn't worked up the courage to say hello. Then soon after that, he left to go to college, but he had never stopped thinking about her. After college, Carl had started a family of his own and became a school teacher. But he lost everything after making some really bad real estate investments a few years ago. And his financial troubles had led to legal trouble. And finally, he'd left his family and gone on the run from the police, living in the woods outside of Seaton Carew. That's when he and Anne had found their way back to each other. One night, in a parking lot near his campsite, Carl saw Anne pull in her car, looking very upset. And this time, he did approach her. It turned out that Anne's husband had only just had his kayaking accident a few weeks earlier, and she was obviously in a very bad place emotionally because of it. She was also desperate for help around the properties that she and her husband had owned together. So that same night, she actually let Carl move into the Cliff. And once Carl moved in, he and Anne began a somewhat unconventional romance. Carl would spend his days working to fix up the apartments inside the Cliff, and then he would spend his nights with Anne in her house. It was weird for both of them to keep their relationship secret, but they both had their reasons. For Carl, he was just afraid of being arrested if anybody knew where he was. He was on the run. And for Anne, she felt like her family and friends expected her to be a grieving widow basically forever. So she didn't want to look like she basically immediately moved on from her dead husband. Now, at some point, the 2 of them hoped that Anne could sell her properties and that they could move far away together and start over. But they both knew that was easier said than done, because Carl would first have to figure out a way to leave the country without getting arrested. Now, Carl watched as Anne and her sons made their way back across the street, and he went back to reading his spy novel. And as he read the story, he made mental notes about the plot line and the main character. because Carl was actually working on a plan that maybe would allow him and Anne to start their new life together. He was actually using all of these spy novels basically as inspiration for this plan. He actually smiled to himself as he thought about how brilliant he was being. And he pictured, that someday in the future, an author would likely write a spy novel about him. It would take another 2 years for Carl to finally work out his plan. But finally, one morning in July of 2006, he was ready to put it all into action. On this morning, he walked through the airport near Seton Carew, trying to act casual as he approached the ticketing counter. He handed his passport to the gate agent and then glanced over his shoulder, looking back to where Anne was. She was standing at the back of the line. She met his eyes, but then quickly sort of looked away because they had agreed to pretend they didn't know each other. When Carl turned back around, he saw the ticketing agent was now staring intently at his passport, and he felt his heart rate begin to pick up. So this passport that Carl was using was a fake. He had created a new identity for himself using the birth and death records of a baby that had been born in the same year as him, which was an idea from the spy novel The Day of the Jackal, about an assassin who constantly changes identities. And if it worked, he and Anne would be able to travel to Panama in Central America. Carl's plan was he was going to stay there permanently if he got to Panama, and he hoped that Anne would love it enough that she would eventually move there too. Carl had read a brochure on Panama that called it a place for schemers, dreamers, and nutcases, which already made him feel right at home. Plus, the country was really cheap compared to the UK and far away from anyone who knew them, so he thought this was like the perfect place for them to move to. But all of that depended on this fake passport being convincing enough that the ticketing agent didn't say anything. And finally, after what felt like a very long time, the agent looked up from the passport and smiled and handed it back to Carl along with his ticket. Carl had to physically stop himself from literally sighing with relief when this happened. And instead, he just, as casually as he could, thanked the agent. And as he walked off, he turned and he sort of winked at Anne, who was still in line. After decades of reading about international spies, Carl kind of felt like one himself, and he liked this feeling a lot. And soon, he would be living permanently as John Jones, an international man of mystery. A few days later, Carl sat beside Anne in the back of a Jeep as a real estate agent drove them through the Panamanian countryside. They sped along the highway into the jungle, and as they did, Carl felt more alive than he had in years. They came around a bend in the road, and suddenly they were driving along a sandy beach, and the realtor pulled over and said to get out and take a look and see if this plot of land felt like it could be their new home. So Carl figured that once Anne sold the cliff apartment building that she owned and combined that money with the money Anne had inherited from her husband's life insurance policies, they'd have around 600,000 pounds in savings, which was around 800,000 American dollars. Now that was more than enough money to get set up, but they were going to need some kind of income in Panama as well. And Carl wanted to buy this land in particular in the jungle and use it to open up an eco-lodge resort. Eco-lodges were becoming really popular in Central America, and tourists paid a lot of money to stay in beachside cabins for a week and go canoeing and horseback riding and jungle trekking. Carl also wanted to build a villa on the property for just him and Anne, right there on the beach. So he led Anne down to the edge of the water and pointed to the tree line on the other side of the bay, and he told her to imagine a row of cabins and a dock for a bunch of canoes and a path that led to a horse stable. And then he pointed to the opposite side of the bay and told her to imagine a beautiful seaside villa where the two of them would live. Anne kicked off her sandals and walked into the water, and Carl could tell that she was picturing what their lives might look like here. To Carl, it was like years of careful planning were finally paying off. I mean, this had been like the best week of his relationship with Anne ever. They had finally been able to act like a normal couple for the first time. They had gone out in public to dinner every night together and walked down the street holding hands. Carl loved living as John Jones. He felt free. And weirdly enough, despite the fact that his identity was fake, he felt like his old self again, the way he used to feel before he got tangled up with all of his debt. By the time they got back to the realtor's office that afternoon, Anne said that she was completely taken with Panama and that, yes, she did want to move here with Carl, and that when she got back to England, she would get her affairs in order and get ready for this big move. Carl beamed, and their realtor grabbed a camera and took a picture of the three of them to commemorate the moment that they had decided to change their lives forever. Hey guys, I have some pretty big news. I know many of you are excited to hear. I am going to be doing another live storytelling tour this year. You can find me in a bunch of cities, including new ones on the West Coast and across the United States, where I have never played before. Plus, I'm really excited to share that I will also be performing in an international city, since so many of you have been asking me to visit. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. And guess what? Tickets for this tour are available right now at tour.ballenstudios.com. In terms of the types of tickets you can buy, they range from general admission to VIP. Again, that's tour.ballenstudios.com. I'm also going to be giving away a trip to meet me at one of my live shows. And so if you want to enter for your chance to win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. Again, that's fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. It took another full year for Anne to sell her properties in Seton Carew and to tell her family that she was moving to Panama, of all places. They had all been shocked at first, but eventually they started to understand that she really needed to get away from England and all the unhappy memories of her old life. Shortly afterwards, Carl bought a condominium in Panama City so that he and Anne would have a place to live while they built their resort. And then finally, on October 22nd, 2007, Anne moved to Panama permanently. However, when Carl picked her up at the airport that night and drove her to their new home, he had to fake a smile because he had recently discovered some news that was going to throw their new life into jeopardy. And so he gave Anne a quick tour of the penthouse apartment, and then he asked her to take a seat at the kitchen table. And immediately, Anne sensed something was off and looked very worried. Carl took a deep breath, and then he told Anne that he was really excited to build their resort together. But there was one last unexpected obstacle standing in the way of their dreams. He said he had only learned about this obstacle a few weeks ago, and he had been waiting for the right moment for them to talk about it. He had just found out that the Panamanian government had instituted new procedures for anyone moving to Panama from another country. And now, English citizens needed to present a certificate of good conduct from the British police to prove they had no criminal record. Now, this was no problem for Anne, but it was a huge problem for Carl, because he was living in Panama as John Jones. So if the police looked into his identity, they would quickly learn that John Jones was a fake identity. Anne put her head in her hands and just said, "What are we going to do?" And Carl said he didn't have an answer yet, but he promised he would figure something out. The next morning, Carl walked with Anne as they window shopped on a busy street in Panama City. And Carl thought about ways that he could get around this awful new procedure. He didn't want to live in this country illegally, because he was done hiding. I mean, the whole point of coming here to Panama was so that he and Anne could live together out in the open. He followed Anne into an old vintage shop so that she could look at furniture. And as he wandered around the shop, he came across a bookshelf full of old books, including a few spy novels. Now, all the books were in Spanish, so he couldn't understand any of them, but he still picked one up and began flipping through it, hoping that maybe it would inspire him. And as he did this, he did feel inspired. But it was not by this book. He remembered the plotline of a different spy novel that he had read over a decade earlier. Even when he had been reading the novel at the time, he had thought that that plotline was too crazy to work in real life. But as they walked around that afternoon, Carl kept coming back to that idea, that plotline, and started to see how he might be able to make that work. Finally, at dinner that night, Carl told Anne that he was pretty sure he knew how to solve their visa problem once and for all. He warned her that the idea was risky, but he was confident that he could pull it off. 6 weeks later, on the afternoon of Sunday, December 2nd, 2007, Carl was back in the United Kingdom, wandering around the West End of London. He did his best to look very confused as he walked through Christmas displays and waited until a store clerk came over to ask if he was okay. And Carl gave her a sort of shy smile and then asked, "Why are all the Christmas decorations up?" And when she said it was December, it's Christmas, that's why, he pretended to be confused about what day it was and where he was. And then he asked the clerk for some help. And just like he had hoped, the store clerk frowned with concern and then escorted him into the nearest police station. And she told the officer at the front desk that something was really wrong with this guy. The officer smiled at Carl and asked what the problem was. And now Carl knew that for his plan to work, he was going to have to give an award-winning acting performance here. So he kind of scratched at his head and then told the officer that he had lost his whole family. The officer sat up and asked for his name. And for the first time in 2 years, Carl didn't say John Jones. Instead, he gave the officer his real name. Because Carl had realized that the only way to truly feel like his old self in Panama was to actually become his old self and reclaim the old identity that he had left behind. But to reclaim this identity without also reclaiming all his old debt and legal problems was going to require one more huge lie. So Carl explained to the police officer that he knew his name, but nothing else about himself, because he said he had amnesia. The officer just stared at Carl, obviously dumbfounded. Then he turned and called for his supervisor. From this moment onward, things moved fast, but not in the direction that Carl or anyone else had expected. Carl had believed that if he just claimed he had amnesia, it'd be like wiping the slate clean in England. He could just resume his old name and his old life and make a plan to pay back his creditors now that he was in a better financial situation with the Eco Lodge. And he'd be able to get a real passport with his real name and live happily and truly openly in Panama. But this was not what happened, because almost immediately, newspapers caught wind of Carl's story, and it made the front page. Because to the rest of the world, Carl had this incredible story. He had supposedly spent years wandering around as a homeless person, never knowing his true identity. And so almost overnight, Carl became big-time international news. The entire world wanted to know, where had he been the past few years? Now, Carl had not expected any of this publicity. So he and Anne were both horrified when 2 days later, a British newspaper published a photograph from an obscure real estate website. And in this picture, Carl can be seen standing with Anne and their realtor and beaming with happiness after a day of viewing properties in Panama. And this photograph was very, very bad for Carl because it proved that he had not been wandering around homeless with amnesia in the UK like he had said to police. But this photo was really bad, really the worst, for Anne, because it proved something more shocking and more terrible than regular old financial fraud. This photo revealed a story so outlandish that it sounds like it must have come directly out of a fictional spy novel. Because it would turn out Anne was not the grieving widow she pretended to be, and her handyman boyfriend, Carl Fenwick, was not Carl Fenwick. Carl's real name, the one he had given that police officer in the UK when he pretended to have amnesia, was John Darwin. He was Anne Darwin's dead husband. He and Anne had faked his death in that kayaking accident to escape his debt, and so that he and Anne could claim life insurance money. Not even their own kids knew that their father was still alive. Only Anne and obviously John did. John and Anne were both soon arrested for fraud and wound up serving more than 3 years in prison. John's very unhappy ending does in some ways mirror the ending of the very book, The Day of the Jackal, which he used for inspiration. In that book, the assassin does lots of impressive things to change his identity, but in the end, he still gets caught. Today's second and final story is about a man who makes an unforgivable mistake and pays dearly for it. At around noon on October 9th, 2018, a 52-year-old Russian engineer named Oleg Belogasov sat in the common room of a tiny research station on a remote island in Antarctica. The common room was like the general hangout, multi-purpose area at the station, and Oleg was in there watching TV, while his coworker, Sergei, sat in a chair nearby, reading a book. They were both drinking alcohol and had been for some time. because when they weren't working, there really was not much else to do besides sit around and drink. So Oleg had been at the station for about 6 months. He was part of a 14-person crew that was doing a year-round research stint, observing the island's ocean and weather patterns and collecting data for their home country of Russia. Oleg was primarily in charge of maintaining the station's machinery and equipment, which took up most of his time. But there was still quite a bit of downtime, which Oleg spent inside, because being outside in Antarctica was generally pretty dangerous. There were hundreds of these lethal, deep ice crevasses that you could barely see, that if you fell into, you're dead, couldn't get out again, or the fall alone would kill you. Obviously freezing temperatures, there's lethal, violent blizzards. I mean, this is not a place built for people. So Oleg and his coworkers really only went outside when their work required it. Otherwise, they stayed put. But inside any of the various buildings at the station, their entertainment options were limited. I mean, there was just this 2-channel TV set, there was a small gym, there was a nearby church, and there was a library. And at this point, Oleg was pretty much sick of everything. I mean, he was even tired of the library. And he loved to read. But the library was really small, and he'd basically read pretty much all the books that were in there. His colleague, Sergey, who was sitting right next to him, he loved reading too. And books were something they both spent a lot of time talking about. So, since Oleg wasn't finding anything good to watch on TV and was feeling bored and kind of stir-crazy, he decided to see if Sergey wanted to get into one of their deep literary conversations. And so Oleg turned off the TV and tossed the remote into the chair and took a swig of his drink, and then he glanced over to the corner where Sergey was reading the novel Fight Club. Oleg had already read Fight Club. It was about this depressed man with insomnia who meets a charismatic stranger and starts this secret club where people literally fight each other. Oleg thought the book was amazing, mostly because it had an epic plot twist at the end. And so Oleg walked over and asked what Sergey thought of the book so far. But Sergey just kind of ignored him. But Oleg wasn't surprised. He knew Sergey really well, since the two of them had worked very closely together on various research projects over the years. So he knew Sergey was generally a very quiet person and not a big talker, whereas Oleg loved getting into big, long, passionate discussions. Sometimes Oleg could get Sergey to open up by asking questions and telling jokes, but today did not seem to be one of those days. Now, this was definitely frustrating for Oleg, but you could tell, Sergey wanted to be left alone, so he stood up and left to go find something else to do. Oleg spent some time just kind of wandering around the station, checking research logs and sipping his drink. He thought about going outside just for a minute to get some fresh air, but when he checked the temperature, he saw that it was below freezing, so he decided against it. And so after 3 hours of trying to kill time, Oleg finally just headed to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. It was around 3 p.m. when Oleg stepped into the dining room, feeling a bit flushed from all the booze he'd been drinking. And the first thing he saw when he got inside of there was Sergey. And Sergey was at a table, still reading Fight Club, just like he'd been doing earlier in the common room. So Oleg got some food and went over to sit with Sergey and see if now, maybe, he was more open to chatting. And to his surprise, Sergey was. When Oleg sat down, Sergey put his book down and looked up, ready to talk, possibly because he'd also had a lot to drink and was feeling kind of chatty. And so the two men began discussing the book, Fight Club. And quickly, their conversation got really energetic because they were both, drunk and excited about what they were saying. And then Oleg made what he thought was a fantastic point about the book and what it all meant. To Oleg, it seemed like everything was going great. But all of a sudden, after making this point, Oleg noticed that Sergey had gone really quiet. And Oleg, who could read Sergey well by this point, knew what this meant. Sergey was done talking and wanted some space. So Oleg looked down at his watch. He actually did need to get some more work done before the day was over, and he was about to look up and tell Sergey that he was going to go leave and check one of their weather instruments. But when he looked up from his watch, Sergey was gone. And at that same exact moment, a wild scream cut through the air right behind Oleg. A few minutes later, in another building, the research station's manager was in his office going through some paperwork when his door suddenly flew open. And when the manager looked up, he saw that one of his employees was standing in the doorway looking completely panicked. The employee's eyes were wide and his breath was ragged, like he was in shock. And when the employee explained why he was so upset, the manager shot to his feet and told the employee not to move. He then grabbed his coat and flew out the door into the freezing cold. The manager pulled on his coat as he ran across the ice-packed ground to the building where the cafeteria was. And the whole way he just felt his panic growing and growing because what that employee had just said had never, ever happened at their research station before. He wasn't even sure if it had happened in the entire continent of Antarctica before. When the manager finally got to the cafeteria, he flung the door open and looked inside, and immediately he felt sick to his stomach. It would turn out Oleg and Sergei had been co-workers for a long, long time. And they did know each other really well. And what that meant was they knew each other so well that Oleg had sort of learned what specifically really annoyed Sergei. And Oleg used this knowledge whenever he got bored and wanted to find a way to entertain himself. The way Oleg would intentionally upset Sergei was by violating a serious rule that virtually every human being knows not to violate. Even if you've never heard the rule explicitly, you know you don't do this. Every time Sergei would start a new book, Oleg would wait until he got about halfway through and then tell him the ending. This was not just a one-time thing. Whenever they talked about books, Oleg repeatedly ruined them for Sergei, which always made Sergei really, really mad. And that day in the cafeteria, when Oleg sat down with Sergei, he didn't just make a great point about Fight Club. He told Sergei how it ended. And don't worry, if you haven't read it or you haven't seen the movie, we are not going to ruin the twist for you because it is amazing. You should check it out. But Oleg did. And Sergei was very drunk. And like Oleg, he had also been very restless and tense from having been cooped up in this isolated station for months on end. And so this time, when Oleg told him the ending, Sergei completely snapped. He grabbed the knife from the kitchen, walked behind Oleg, and began repeatedly stabbing him in the chest while allegedly screaming, "Didn't see that coming, did ya?" Once Sergei calmed down, he was so shocked by what he'd done that he immediately turned himself in to the station's manager. He was then transported back to Russia and arrested, but he was eventually acquitted since he had no previous record. Oleg's heart was damaged in the attack, but amazingly, he would survive after being transported to a hospital. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Cases like this don't happen. Hey, what's going on, guys? MrBallen's here. You probably know me from TikTok. In fact, I bet there's a percentage of people that are on this YouTube video just because they watched my TikTok version of this case, the Jamie Close case. And so thank you for making the jump and watching the full version. I hope you'll stick around and you'll actually subscribe to my channel because I'm trying to make YouTube my primary medium for sharing stories with the world. It'll be much the same content that I'm putting on TikTok, scary stories, murder mysteries, unsolved stuff, spooky stuff, dark stuff, just kind of anything that's compelling. And YouTube's going to be the place where I try to do that primarily. And so I'm already committing to doing one video on YouTube a week. I'm trying to make it two. This is the first week I've done two, so we'll see how it plays out. I do have 3 kids and other job responsibilities, so it's a little hard to juggle, but I love doing this stuff. So please, if you enjoy this video and you like my content, please subscribe, please stick around. So with today's case, the Jamie Close case, the reason I ended up choosing this one and making a TikTok version of it, now a YouTube version of it, is actually pretty straightforward. It's because even though it's true, if you were to make a movie out of this case, the viewers wouldn't really believe it because the perpetrator in this case has no motive and has no history of committing any crimes. I think he had a parking ticket. And he targets a child. Putting that all together, you don't see that. That is not a popular archetype for a movie. The idea that there are just these random, perpetrators out there just targeting random children and harming them and their families, there has to be a motive, especially when it comes to children being involved. There has to be a motive. And in this case, there really wasn't. And even the perpetrator, when he was in prison, he wrote a letter to Jamie and her surviving family members where he kind of tried to explain why he did it, but even he didn't have strong enough language to communicate what it was. He made it seem like it was pretty complicated, and even he didn't know. He just said, hey, look, I'm not a serial killer. I just had to do this, and I don't really know why. So it's just one of the more disturbing cases when you go into it knowing that this whole thing was perpetrated by someone who had no criminal history. He had no connection to the victims, except that he randomly had a chance encounter with one of them. And it just kind of happened. It's just one of those horrible things that even now, no one really understands, including the killer himself. So let's dive into it. In 2018, 21-year-old Jake Patterson is on his way to work at a cheese factory in Wisconsin. He'd only been working there for a couple of days. This is like his third day on the job. You know, he's this kind of typical guy leading a typical life in Wisconsin, and he's driving his Ford Taurus. He comes to a stop behind a school bus where middle school kids are getting on the bus, and he's sitting there, and he looks up and he sees, for the first time in his life, a blonde-haired, green-eyed girl who ended up being 13-year-old Jamie Close. And as he's sitting there, because this all came out in a very lengthy confession, so we have lots of details about this case. As he's sitting there watching Jamie, who again, he doesn't know, get on the bus, he has this realization that she is going to be the girl that he takes. He actually says that sitting behind the wheel, he's like, I realized right then and there that she's the one I'm gonna take. And so a guy with no criminal history, he's sitting there coming up with this plan of how he's gonna abduct this girl. And it would come out later in his confession, which again is very lengthy, that he put a ton of effort into planning out this abduction. So let's talk about Jake's plan. He takes his father's Mossberg 12-gauge shotgun, which is a very commonly purchased weapon. He assumed that because it is, so widely purchased, it would be hard to track. Okay, so he takes his gun, takes a couple slugs, so he's got his weapon. Then he goes and purchases a balaclava, so a mask, a whole head mask from Walmart. He shaves his head, shaves his beard so there wouldn't be any hairs, for forensic evidence at the crime scene. This is all so premeditated. He went out and purchased gloves and wiped his gloves all so they wouldn't have prints on them. He purchased steel-toed boots and dark jeans and a dark jacket. In the car he was going to use, because he plans on abducting Jamie, and he knew he was going to be keeping her in the trunk. He cut the cord inside of his vehicle. It was when you press this button inside the car, it would open the trunk. Basically, he didn't want any access to the trunk unless he had the key. So he cuts that cord. He disconnected the dome light inside of his Taurus, his Ford Taurus, to try to better conceal him when he's in the car. I mean, this guy, he's really thinking hard about how he's going to do this. He knew he was going to go in that house, he's going to take Jamie, and he had his big plan, right? 2 separate times, Jake tried, unsuccessfully, to abduct Jamie. He drove to their house the first time, and there were cars in the driveway, so he got spooked and he leaves. He comes back, and he's about to drive up the driveway when lights come on, so he leaves again. But on October 15th, 2018, unfortunately, he was successful. It was around midnight when Jake Patterson rolls into the Close family's driveway. The lights in his car are off, the headlights are off, and he rolls into the driveway. And inside of this very modest home, Jamie was sleeping with her dog, Molly. And Molly hears the car pull into the driveway and starts barking. Wakes up Jamie. Jamie looks out, she sees a car she doesn't recognize, it's the middle of the night, and she runs to her parents' room. She alerts her parents. Jamie's father, James, he goes to the front door with a flashlight. Meanwhile, Denise, that's Jamie's mother, and Jamie retreat into the bathroom where they shut the door, They sensed that this was potentially going to be a home invasion, and certainly they were right. So they actually barricade the door with a dresser that was in there. And they get in the tub and they shut the curtains. And so James is at the front door and he watches Jake Patterson get out of his car, calmly walk up the steps to the front door. And at this time, James is thinking that perhaps this is the police. And so when Jake arrives at the door and starts banging on the door, James shines his light out through the window, kind of gets a peek at him, then moves over to the door itself where there's this little tiny window on the door. And he looks through, shining the light, and he says, "Show me your badge." And unfortunately, it was at the same time that Jake raises his shotgun and pulls the trigger, shoots right through the glass, hits James, and James dies immediately. Back in the bathroom, Jamie would later say that when she heard that shotgun blast, that she knew that her father was dead. And I think Denise, her mother, knew that as well, because immediately Denise picks up her phone and calls 911 as she's talking to the dispatcher who said that there were no police in the area. So further confirming that this was definitely not the police, because they didn't see that interaction at the door, they just heard it. Jake at the front door is trying to bust in the door. He can't do it, so he takes his shotgun, ejects a spent round, and then puts a slug through the doorknob, making it come wide open. He pushes it open, steps over the body of James, and begins to search the house. The house is empty, every door is open except one, and it's the bathroom door where Denise and Jamie are hiding in the bathroom. Jake begins to try to push the door open. He can't do it, and finally he just starts trying to smash the door in. And after 10, 15 blows, he actually managed to split the top half of the door open because the dresser was blocking the lower half. He goes into the bathroom and he rips down the shower curtain, and there is Denise bear hugging and protecting her daughter, Jamie, in the tub. Jake hands duct tape to the mother, Denise, and tells her to put duct tape over the mouth and the hands of the daughter. She refuses, she's protecting her daughter. Jake sets his shotgun down, pushes Denise aside, and does it himself. And then, after getting Jamie out of the tub, he picks his shotgun up again, aims it at the mother, turns his head, and he pulls the trigger and he kills the mother. Picks up Jamie, she's only about 5 foot, 100 pounds, and he drags her out to his car, opens up the trunk of his Taurus, puts her in, shuts it, and he's on his way. He was in the house for a total of 4 minutes. He would say in his confession, Jake, that as he's driving away, about 20 seconds after departing the house, he saw all the cop cars coming down the road, and actually police officers would say they remembered a Taurus yielding to the police cruisers as they came in. He makes his way around them and off he goes. And Jamie would say she remembered hearing the sirens and then they fade as they disappear. Jake would drive 70 miles to his house where he would keep Jamie prisoner. For the next 3 months, investigators, the local population, everybody is looking for Jamie. And at the same time, people didn't have high hopes for her safe return. In the vast majority of cases like these, where a child's been abducted, unfortunately, they usually don't get home safe. And so the whole community is just devastated. This is gaining national attention. Everybody's looking for Jamie and they can't find her. The whole time, she was being held 70 miles away in Jake Patterson's cluttered, kind of crummy house that was out in the middle of the woods. When they got to his house, he burned her clothes and his gloves and the duct tape. He gave her his sister's pajamas, and then he had her go under the bed, this bed he had in the house, and he barricaded her underneath the bed. So she had a pillow and a blanket, and she was just underneath this bed. That was it. She basically was ignored. Her captor, Jake Patterson, he puts her under the bed, and he warns her, if you leave or try to escape, bad things are going to happen to you. And because she did witness him kill her parents, she knows he's capable of that, and he knows that she knows that he's capable of that. So he had this stranglehold on her where he basically just said, "You're staying under the bed, and don't you dare leave." And she listened, and frankly, you can't blame her, right? And so she would go stretches of 8, 10, 12 hours of laying under the bed with no food, no water, no bathroom breaks, But ultimately, she was just kind of ignored. There wasn't really a plan for what was going to happen when she got to the house. He just kind of neglected her. After 2 weeks where he was really on guard, and he told her that he was keeping a shotgun right outside her door in case anything went down with the police, when no one came looking for them, or when no one arrived at his place, he felt very confidently that he had gotten away with his crimes, to the point where Jamie would say, he started having guests over. He had friends over, and he just told her, stay in the room, don't come out. And so for 87 days, that's how it was. She just was neglected. This poor girl was underneath this bed, just wondering what the heck's going to happen, with obviously no time to grieve over the loss of her parents. Mr. Patterson, he really didn't leave the house. And when he did, I think he left one time to visit a grandparent, and he was very aggressive in warning her that he would hurt her if she tried to leave. But for the most part, he didn't leave the house. But you could tell in looking at this case that he became fairly confident that he was just going to get away with this. And so he actually applied for a job. And he left one morning to go to the interview. And it's kind of funny, in a dark way, he wrote on his, what did he write? On his application that he's an honest, hardworking guy, and under skills, he said he doesn't have much work experience, but he shows up to work and is a quick learner. And so here he goes out to just get a job and go back to normal. And when he left that morning, Jamie, who's under the bed, she's done. She's not going to be a captive anymore. And as soon as he leaves, she pushes aside the barricade of, there's some weights that were there and dresser. She pushes it all aside. She runs out, she puts on his shoes, which are too big for her. She puts them on the wrong feet, and she runs out the door. She doesn't know where she is. She doesn't know anything, but she's gone. A woman was walking her dog around 4 p.m. Her name was Jeannie Nutter, and she sees this girl, this teenager, who doesn't have a coat on. She doesn't have gloves on. It's bitterly cold. They're in the middle of Wisconsin in the wintertime. And she sees her coming towards her, and she can tell kind of instinctively that something's wrong. Okay, this is not just some nice kid coming down the road. There's an issue here. And as she got closer, and the girl said, "I'm lost. I need help. My name is Jamie," the woman, Jeannie, said that she immediately knew who it was. She lived in the area, and she had seen the posters up for Jamie. She knew exactly who she was. She gave her a big hug and held her and said, "I've got you. I'm going to take care of you." And so, holding her closely, she brings her to a nearby neighbor's house. She said, "This is Jamie Close. We have to call the police." And they go in there, and the homeowners got their weapons out, and they guarded the door, and they huddled around Jamie while Jeannie called the police. And the police just didn't even know what to do. They were so shocked that they had found Jamie Close that it actually took a minute for them to recognize what they were saying and how urgent it was that you come here right now, because at some point her captor, who can't be that far away, is going to recognize that she's not there anymore. And so they send the police, and luckily Jamie is brought in and is saved. Certainly not from the emotional toll, but she's physically safe. Jake comes home from his big job interview, and he sees that Jamie's gone, and he sees footsteps leaving his property in the snow, and he goes out looking for her. And just because this is the way things go sometimes, he was immediately rounded up by the police. They found his car, they found him, and as soon as he was pulled over, he didn't resist. In fact, he immediately identified himself and said that he did it. Jake Patterson was given a life sentence without the opportunity for parole, so he will die in prison. But to this day, no one really understands how this could have happened. And going back to what I said at the beginning, cases like this don't happen. There's always some reason for a crime such as this. We can't, as human beings, accept that some stranger has the ability to randomly target a child and go as far as to kill their parents in front of them and hold them hostage when they have no criminal history. There's no red flags. He happened to see her getting on a bus, and that was all he needed. I mean, how could that possibly be the case? But in this unfortunate case, it just is. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. Please hit like and subscribe. I'll be doing stories like this one and many more, mysteries, scary stories, spooky stuff, interesting stuff. on this channel at least once a week, so I hope that you will continue to tune in. And please follow me on social media. I am Mr. Ballen on TikTok, and I am John Ballen 416 on Instagram. If you have story suggestions, you can hit me up on Instagram, and I will definitely get back to you. So that's going to do it, guys. Thank you all very much. Talk to you soon.